we aim to work strategically and consistently, and I believe we should dedicate more analytical, more intellectual resources towards analyzing this area and to collaborate and to coordinate our action, because in order to ensure a good energy market operation, we have to focus, and market operation in general, we have to focus a lot on energy issues and points. And we need to ensure the reserve power having. Thank you so much, and have a good conference.
Thank you, Minister, for this very broad geopolitical perspective, which provides impetus to our further discussion. And now I'd like to invite the participants of the first panel, primarily the moderator, Simona Merkinaitė, who is the Senior Project Manager of Eastern Europe Study Center and also chairpersons of 2 parliamentary committees, the chairperson of the Committee on National Security and Defense of the Parliament, Laurynas Kasčiūnas, and the chairperson of the Committee on Human Rights, Tomas Vytautas Raskevičius. Good morning. Pleased to see you all. Also, congratulations to everyone viewing us online. The first panel of this conference, as Linas said, is dedicated to challenges coming from Belarusian regime, bringing together Laurynas Kasčiūnas, the chairperson of the Parliamentary Committee on National Security and Defense, and Tomas Vytautas Raskevičius, the chairperson of the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights. The fact that we have security and human rights components already is telling in terms of challenges coming from Belarus today. And as we are thinking how we should start this discussion, I asked the panelists how good we are in responding to challenges coming from the Belarusian regime and where we are now, because to provoke harsher discussion, we could say that over this year there are certain achievements and also some challenges, definitely, so far having no response, such as the fact that Lukashenko remains the factual leader of Belarus, and we saw over the years that not only does he violate the rights of his own citizens, but also international law, and so far he gets away with it. Belarusian citizens continue being prosecuted and persecuted, and while Lukashenko launched the hybrid migration crisis over this year, what he has achieved is that the focus of discussion shifted. He managed to impose a certain mode of discussion, since the majority and the media mostly focus on migration crisis and speak about broader issues such as Lithuania's and Poland's migration policies and compliance with humanitarian law, while decreasing focus is on situation in Belarus, and also keeping in mind huge security challenge, which is also becoming worse due to deepening union between Russia and Belarus. So the first question to our panelists is how good we are in dealing with this challenge from authoritarianism from perspectives of security and human rights. As we speak about challenges coming from the Belarusian regime and our relations with this challenge, it consists of 3 components: definitely the national security, diplomacy, foreign policy, and definitely humanitarian or human rights challenge. As we are now observing the perspective of our relations since the summer last year, when the undemocratic elections happened in Belarus, sparking protests in Belarus, I would say that back then the Belarusian state focused on the diplomatic and humanitarian components of this crisis. And it was really interesting that this summer, when the so-called hybrid attack started, with migration process being one of the components, this balance strongly shifted towards the national security challenge. I don't assess whether it's good or bad, but I think we are becoming precarious when one of these components is not fully exercised. The recent days' events on sanctions also show challenges in diplomacy, while my political priority definitely is speaking about human rights related to the migration context, and I think that in this we have many wrong decisions made. One of them, I not only apply it to the Lithuanian political elite, but one of the fundamental mistakes, in my opinion, is when we speak about the rights of migrants. By this, we mean the humanitarian corridor from Belarus. By this, I want to say that the fact that these people came legally to Belarus and Lukashenko's regime keeps them hostages, which means they don't allow them to come back even if they want to. It means that these people are being kept hostages. And we had a similar situation with Ryanair flight landing when Lithuanian citizens were kept hostages by the regime. And while we speak about it, we offer diplomatic blackmailing tools to Lukashenko while he's being portrayed as the only actor who can address this humanitarian catastrophe. So in essence, my proposal as we speak about it, and I'm sure that Lorinas will speak a lot about security challenges, my proposal is also to bear in mind the diplomatic aspect, the importance of diplomacy and sanctions, and also humanitarian aspect. Because in my opinion, it is when democratic states start playing by the rules imposed by a dictator, we lose automatically, because then we lose effectiveness and efficiency in our decisions, because decisions take much longer in our case. To finalize, I would like to mention one more aspect about the imposed narratives. So instrumentalized migration crisis has fully eliminated our domestic discussion on political opposition in Belarus and the sanctions applied to the regime. I think that the focus should be brought back to this situation, and immediately when we find a way to address this instrumentalized migration tool. Thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, my congratulations to the team of the Eastern Europe Study Center, Linus, and other representatives continuing this tradition that were launched in my times, the annual conference dedicated to Stasys Lozoraitis. Well done, guys. And of course, this is a very broad context that we would like to use to discussing migration and a broader look of what is happening in our region. I wouldn't be so sure that Lukashenko succeeded in imposing his rules of the game on us. I would like to argue why. But I would start with migration, and later I would turn to the broader geopolitical landscape. I would start with the fact that his thinking of organizing migration flows to Lithuania, and these first messages were clearly articulated in May, and definitely this was an attempt to create a mechanism to punish us for our value-based policy. Because we don't recognize him as a legitimate leader, what he really wants, and that we were those speaking about continuity of sanctions and necessary collective sanctions, and because we became a certain hub of Belarusian democratic opposition, and he wanted to punish us. And he decided to do it according to the methods tested by Russia in 2015 in Norway and Finland. I would remind the story of bicycles in far north, where they would organize international illegal migration. But Russia didn't need to organize flights. There were sufficient numbers of illegal migrants whom they just pushed from illegal market to borders of Finland and Norway. And this method, named by Russian strategist, which they named as enforced cooperation. So you create a problem, you create a zone of influence, and they say, if you want, we can cooperate to address it. So let's sit down and discuss it. And they would discuss on what Russia wanted from Nordic states. And the same thinking was Lukashenko's in his first speeches when he was shouting at Lithuania and threatening these 6-hour-long speeches. Sometimes you might miss something, but in the end he would send a message that, of course, we can agree, we can make a deal. And this was his strategy. So what would be at the negotiation table? This would be, of course, lifting sanctions and recognition of his legitimacy, that he wants to get out of isolation. And we didn't play this game. We didn't accept it. Though both in Lithuania and in foreign states, there were some actors who say that we should sit down and talk to him. We should be agreeing. We know on what we should be discussing. So actually he failed to impose his rules of the game, while our decision, and a very strong value-based decision, in the beginning, somewhat unexpected and strong-willed decision to start the policy of returning migrants, spoiled his game and mixed up his cards. This is why his policy failed, because we decided to defend our border. And interestingly, the European community, which would never adapt its tools to a certain case when someone would instrumentalize migration, when someone would turn it into a tool of their foreign policy, the European community was not adapted to it. But now we see that the community of Europe is changing. I would even say that we are changing the policy of migration in this regard. Again, I don't want to say that, that it contradicts human rights. No, I would say that the path of illegal migration, development of illegal migration, and ideas of Lukashenko on humanitarian corridor from Minsk to Munich or Berlin is bad for human rights, because this is a new route of illegal migration. This is an encouragement for people to go sacrifice their families and their children with unknown perspectives. So by stopping this policy and by stopping illegal migration, we are on the side of human rights. We're sending messages. Don't sacrifice lives of your family members and loved ones. So this was about human rights, so to say. So his plan failed in this regard. His scenario was very different. Of course, later they would attack Poland. We know why. Because on one hand, Poland doesn't defend the border so much, and this is the direct route to Germany, and also because of Poland's relations with the European institutions. So they would try to create humanitarian crises, and they use the human rights aspect to put Poland on par with Belarus, and maybe to start some negotiations and to get recognition due to the fact of negotiations. So even the phone calls that produced some questions remained very technical, on the technical level, so they failed to create this vision. So to start from this topic up to the geopolitical field, regime. Well, we don't speak maybe that much about political prisoners, but still the sanctions exist from these political imprisonments, and it is not accepted as normal. He did not manage to get the lifting of sanctions because of imprisonments. Yes, there are certain shifts of focus, but the fundamentals remain. We say that you must do some fundamental work if you want us to review the sanctions. So the message remains the same. From the perspective of regime, there are two main aspects. On one hand, of course, the President Lukashenko managed to keep the loyalty of interior structures and support of Russia, which enabled him to survive. Still, this autocratic regime would also have social contract with the society, with some groups in the society. They would say, we don't have democracy, but we don't need it. It's enough for us to have something to eat. So this social contract doesn't exist anymore. It's over. It's obvious. So they only rely on repressions. And while the academic studies show there are certain studies of repressions at a certain way, the cycle of repressions has to go down. So let's wish this final stage to lead to freedom and democracy. Oh, this was the nice ending. So keeping to this thought and viewing the balance of powers now, so as Lithuania definitely is not only about reactive policy, we actively shape it. So what are the priorities for next year? What would you say? So maybe Thomas, so that Lorinas can have some rest. So departing from what Lorina said, and of course we can very quickly go to the discussion and dialogue on the measures that we apply. We take strong measures, and some measures address consequences rather than causes of some phenomena. The effectiveness of returning migrants back was really high, and the regime was confused. However, this return of migrants resulted in the situation that we have at the Polish border, when Polish port guards would push back the migrants with water cannons, provoke some questions from Europe. And the calls from German Chancellor to the regime were sanctioned by the situation. So we should not fall asleep on laurels, and these practices are changing, and they will continue producing challenges to us as democratic societies. And in this regard, we would wish more discussion and hearing to each other, rather than finding some very simple solutions to very complicated challenges. So I'll try to set some priorities. Starting with migration, of course, it's about finalizing the physical barrier, which would be finalized by September next year. And I would like to praise the state companies run by Donatas Kreivys. They are doing a very good job. We're almost on schedule. So physical barrier and border surveillance, and we will have the modern border surveillance system in Europe, which will probably have to compete with a very modern system in Poland, but probably it will be on par. It's for deterring. This is not a silver bullet, definitely, but this is for deterring, and it will enable our border system to react quickly. The pushback policy should also be continued, and our diplomacy contributed to the fact that European institutions managed to see the countries, the intermediary companies that wanted to profit from it. So they decided to cut these links with Belarusian regime. So we should constantly monitor these links, and the European institutions should use sanctions and convincing to cut these links. And also, of course, to press Belarus to keep the humanitarian corridor not from Minsk to Berlin, but to the countries of origin. Speaking about the preparation of the Lithuanian state, I would say that this crisis also has shown is that the border between war and peace is blurring. So civilian life is getting the elements of war. We will keep living in gray zone. We will not live in stages of declared war. So this is a political decision on how you react to certain incidents. So first, it can seem like a civilian situation, but it can be transformed into military. So when we as a state are prepared for this, this is very important. So far we have managed this test well. So interior system is not only about the law and justice, but also about national security, because the first blow was against the border guards, police, and this should be seen as an integral part of defense system. We should also check our legal systems and regimes. Are they adequate to the situations? I would say they are quite adequate. Extraordinary and local emergency and other procedures make us stronger. And going to broader context, the factor of Ukraine has changed from the spring is that no one sees Belarus as a possibility for neutrality. It is not seen anymore. This is an integrated space. So the migration crisis is being created next to us, and escalation in Ukraine can be well interconnected. This is why we should see a broader picture. So we should see these phenomena next to our border and Ukrainian border in context. So what can be out of it? So this escalation can maybe lead to almost a recognition of his rights to veto NATO expansion to the east and to stop the activeness of NATO in the east. This should be avoided, so that we don't have any agreements that there are no NATO enforcement east of Berlin. So these should be clear red lines, because we know strategic culture of Russia is very simple. So you escalate and then you negotiate. So you make war and then you say, oh, let's discuss peace. So this thinking works for some people in the West, and people decide to talk to them about the peace after them taking some positions. And this is definitely a challenge to our diplomacy. Thank you.
I would like to say that we will soon give the possibility to the audience to ask questions. And using the moderator's privilege, I'd like to say that there is let's say, the basic textbook of authoritarianism, namely how to go for their aims, just to juxtapose democratic states in various aspects, the value aspect and other aspects, and it was touched upon when talking about human rights, security, migration. So, Thomas, the question is to you: how should we look for the balance between these two main things and not to give in to the manipulations? The answer, I believe it's hard to strike balance, and there's a good saying that you cannot choose your neighbors. They are as they are, and our neighbors are as they are, and they reflect processes taking place in the society, our society as well, which actually shows both positive and negative trends. And we need to look for a solution. In terms of the migration crisis, we have seen that we are intolerant to people of other ethnic groups, and we see their arrival in our state as a major threat, but the negative and society reaction made it harder to control the situation. In terms of other processes, we have to talk about the value-based policy, and in terms of sanctions based on values could in certain cases pose economic challenges. We shouldn't say we are bad, but we should remember that we are in the center of certain processes which allow us to think both about the neighbors' behaviors, but also to identify our own status in terms of values, not only in terms of military and security terms. Yes. value and pragmatism. We are discussing this for about 20 years. And back in 2004, I believe Artūras Paulauskas talked about it at Vilnius University, and the values were discussed then, and we have discovered the value-based narrative at that time. I believe that protecting our values is our national interest. And I would say also tightly related to the national security policy. Of course, Lukashenko's regime and other regimes know perfectly well how to play based on the weak links of various countries, and they're trying to use economic and other pressures in order to avoid serious sanctions applicable against them. Certain things like that do exist. We could speak about how much the European mechanisms are applicable to withstand the pressures of authoritarian regimes against us. We have focused a lot on protecting the investment sectors, and we have the National Commission on the Protection of Strategic Sites, and it has eliminated Chinese companies from certain competitions, public tendering procedures, and those companies went to Lithuanian courts, then to European courts. So we have to learn how to work with how to deal with the authoritarian regime, and it's a serious job. And that could be an example. And our position regarding China, we are not dependent on China. Our export and import to China from China is on 20-something place. Therefore, we make our decisions and vote based on our own national interests, not on Chinese interests, which is real in certain countries, European countries. Therefore, we have good mechanisms, good levers on how to limit such influences and pressures. Not everywhere is fine, but I believe we are in quite a good situation compared to other European states. Thank you so much to the speakers. So now we have questions. Please ask your questions. So it seems that it's all clear. Hello, Aušra Arnauskaitė from Žinių Radijas. I'd like to ask you about Lithuanian value-based policy works regarding to potassium fertilizer transit through Lithuania. It's not only related to the fact that it's the US sanction, but we know what kind of company Belaruskali is and what it funds. Well, it should be stopped as soon as possible, that transit. Well, we're moving towards the stopping of that transit. Well, your question is right, especially in terms of why now, why not earlier. But basically, we should see the whole view. The sanctions are impactful when you close all the ways for transit. For example, let's just think aloud, as I'm doing now. If Lithuanian railway stops the transit, does the Latvian one do the same? Let's say, would the Norwegian company stop it or keep working on transit? Well, there are no secondary or second-tier sanctions. Sanctions could be the possibility for somebody to win based on this situation. Therefore, I believe our minister's decision is very good in order to have all the sanctions on equal footing, so that all the ways are closed, so that nobody makes profit out of these sanctions. For example, there are companies that could actually have one company as a scapegoat and use other companies for transits, and everything should be taken into account in the wider context. But I believe that the National Government Commission that will start its investigation about Belarus Kali and other players headed by Darius Golis will make their best to stop the transit. I would agree with the statement that authoritarian regimes that move towards using brutal force, they sooner or later experience internal pressure because their societies are looking for ways to withstand and contradict that pressure. And we are in a strange phase. On the one hand, we say it's gratifying that we have given asylum to lots of Belarusian opposition, and that Madam Tsikhanovskaya refers to Vilnius as her second home throughout the world. However, on the other hand, the opposition leaders who went out of Belarus could perhaps hardly make a major impact on the new wave of Belarusian internal opposition to the regime. Should Lithuania change its policy or rethink its policy towards Belarusian society and the regime? If yes, what should be our main position and key points in it? If we believe that the regime leader Lukashenko will sooner or later stop being the one. Maybe Vitas should answer this question. He is best informed about who comes and who goes. Yes, Thomas, it's a good observation. That's a fact. All the forces that can go against the regime, some of it is out of Belarus already. That's a fact, and it's a dilemma. I do understand those people, yes. And perhaps this is one of the strategic decisions of Lukashenko to get them out of the country. In terms of other things, I don't know how much we are able, or the European Union is able to do such things. Maybe somebody will not like what I'll say. But anyway, Belarusian national identity as it is, how the nation sees itself, how it positions itself. Could it be the Maidan option? I can't say that it lacks something, but I believe that the society has formed and developed differently. And perhaps that national development was lacking in order to make this understanding and civilization-based decision. And that revolution which happened in last August, it wasn't sort of geopolitical. They wished to get rid of the authoritarian regime, but it didn't have the geopolitical dimension. Whether we have the power to change and influence it somehow, that's a question. But I would pay attention to the national identity in Belarus, and I would love it to be stronger, if I can say so. Just to share my thoughts on this point, I will remember the idea of Mr. Vaitiekūnas, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and foreign ambassador, that Belarus civil society is watching us. And if we manage to say that that beating a person like a dog for his political beliefs is totally unacceptable, we should also show the similar position, that namely keeping people hostages on the border is unacceptable. So we can. This is how we can develop that space of respect beyond our borders. Thank you. Another question. But on the other hand, I would like ask Vytis Jurkonis, the chair of the board of our EESC and the instructor at Vilnius University, the Institute of International Relations and Political Sciences, to say a few words. Well, thank you. Oftentimes in Lithuania, we're looking for the guilty parties, but I believe we should instead look for decisions or solutions. And as our conversationalists, members of parliament said, the Belarusian policy is and its actions are not new. They try to divert our attention, which is not new. When we had the OSCE, and they tried to actually say that we have betrayed Ales Belatsky on the international arena. And the human rights activists said that how dared you? And the geopolitical discussions and saying that if we press too much on human rights, we will give Belarus to Kremlin. It sounds really absurd to me, because Kremlin has nothing to do with human rights, I believe. And on the other hand, from the historical viewpoint, if we look at Lukashenko's regime, it's not we who push, but it's Lukashenko who pushes Belarus towards Kremlin's arms, and we should really capture it. And national security and human rights are not different polarities. I believe this opposition is artificial. It's not true, and I would say it's dangerous, and we shouldn't look for striking a balance. We shouldn't think either or. We should think and between the two. And sometimes out of the context we say that we have failed to change the regime. Do we have to change the regime, to replace the regime? Is Lithuania daring so much that we believe it's our right and duty to replace the regime in Belarus? No, we have to give our voice for choosing, for Belarusian people to choose their head of the state and to ensure their rights. So instead of thinking, should we support Latushka or somebody else, just like Kremlin interferes with these processes. So let's not give the basis for Kremlin's propaganda to talk nonsense about us. So our purpose is for the international legal norms to be valid, and we have said that the election faked, which was confirmed by others too, and we are talking maybe less about it compared to how much we talked about it half a year ago. But as we are talking about humanitarian situation, I would follow up on what Thomas said. The humanitarian situation started earlier than in summer 2021. We're talking about Belarusian nationals who were made to leave, some illegally, some with visas, and Lithuania was readier at that time to respond fast because we have human rights defenders and information sources, and we can determine that this person is under threat really. And it's harder to determine that in terms of Middle East people? Do we have contacts in Iraq or in Africa who could say that this person is really under threat instead of being just a simple opportunist looking for a better life? The predominant majority of European states, European Union states, have faced similar situations. And in terms of voluntary return, not only Kurds or Syrians would like to go back. I mean, they would like to go back home. So let's bring back the human rights and freedoms point of the agenda and keep it among the top 3 in our agenda. Because if human rights and democracy are present in Belarus, we wouldn't have these challenges on our borders. And the same is applicable to other states, be it Azerbaijan or Tajikistan. In terms of very faraway countries, I'd like to remind you that a couple of years ago, the highest number of inflowing refugees was where from? From Tajikistan. It was a faraway state, and the flow was dominated by people, supporters or members of the Islam Revival Party. So we have to look also historically at the past flows. So the question is not about juxtaposing or striking a balance between human rights and national security, but we have to integrate human rights into the national security issue. 5 years ago, we talked about kleptocratia, that it has to be integrated into the national security agenda, and I believe we could do the same, integrate democracy and human rights into the national security agenda in terms of sanctions, in terms of reputation harm. What about Norway? They are the major potassium buyer. Do they have democracy and human rights? I don't say that it's good, but for 5 years already we've been talking that sanctions should be both declared and implemented, and this is the major problem in all the EU states. For example, in Crimea, Siemens turbines are generating power, and this is a major challenge to not only to Lithuania and the EU, and both in Lithuania and the EU, we have to acknowledge that there are lots of consultancy companies, lawyers, firms that help to overcome those sanctions or bypass those sanctions. This is what is being done by Malinovsky with the Enablers Act. That's the purpose of it. And we need to think that there should be no people who are saying it's just business and bypass the state-imposed sanctions and state positions. That's a challenge, yes. But I believe that we are ahead. If we are looking at Europe, and Belarus does see us as the champions in terms of Belarus, who speak a lot about freedom and democracy, and at the same time we should go back to the ground and understand that we are not replacing the president and the society of Belarus. That will take time, but we are extending our helping hand and some major investments to the future, and the nation of Belarus will not forget it. And this could not be bought by any money or any programs. And these relations will give the future basis for our bilateral relations. And the regime fights, of course, it's natural. And that it's supported by another regime, it's also very natural. And I believe the major issue for us is not to be alone. Let's to talk with our Baltic partners, Visegrad region partners, and European partners. And I believe if we count bilateral calls and consultations during last years and how big the Lithuanian voice is, well, we have a lot of activities done, and we have to maintain this level of activities, not to limit ourselves with selfies and ticking the boxes, but we have to work so that human rights and democracy and national security are reintegrated and combined.
Thank you, Vitis. We are out of time unless you have very small comments to finalize and to follow up on Vitis. Well, Paluskas came into the room, so now it's also red. So I think it's over. So I would like to thank the panelists and the audience. So we have the Lithuanian Foreign Policy Review in your packages, where there are some papers on Belarus as well. So please feel free to read. Thank you so much. So we have this very blitz conference, so we don't make large breaks, and we proceed straight to session 2 on relations with China. And I'm inviting the panelists on this topic, primarily moderator Vladimir Slochis, who is the chief analyst of the Eastern Europe Studies Center, and 2 members of parliament. First of all, Matas Maldeikis, who is the chairperson of Interparliamentary Relations with the Chinese Republic, Taiwan, and Gintautas Paluckas, already mentioned, the chairperson of the Social Democratic Group in the parliament. So I'm giving the floor to Vladimiras. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We have started our second panel on relations with China, and our panelists will have 5 to 7 minutes to present your main points. But immediately, I would also ask a couple of questions for the beginning. One, on yesterday's points coming from Mr. Januszka, who I think said yesterday that as we have opened the trade representation with Taiwan, it would be very important to see at least several more states to do the same, to open representations of Taiwan. So my question is, if this were really useful, how would we see the situation if these offices don't open in the upcoming months, half a year or the year, and Lithuania will remain the only one to host this representation? Maybe this will be bad for our reputation and our value-based policies. Moreover, the fact that we see that Nicaragua has left the list of 15 friends of Taiwan, and they have agreed to be friends with China. So this is question 1. And the second question, on continuity of our policy, let's remember in 2012 to 16, the then government was strengthening ties with China, which was very recent, and now we are worsening these ties. So the question, first of all, to Mr. Paluckas: if you win the upcoming election and you will shape the government, maybe you will close down the Taiwanese representation and come back to business as usual. So maybe now let's start with Gintautas and then Matas. Is it on? Okay, so I'm pleased to start this reflection and deliberation, be it sprint or marathon, but I think it should be up to the incumbent powers, because what is different is the decision not to seek for consensus. Because previously we would have deliberations between position and opposition. Now we see quite unilateral and fragmented foreign policy. So as we speak about the future, I still have hope that over the remaining 3 years we'll be able to do something good to reach consensus on foreign policy, and maybe certain diplomatic tensions will contribute to it. Coming back to this specific question, if we close down something or not, and will we have a moral right as we assess some continuity in foreign policy, it's difficult for us to answer. First of all, I dislike this very concept of this choice. Either China or Taiwan. Obviously, we cross some red lines that China doesn't like, and we had been warned about it. And we have driven ourselves into this corner. Previously, we would have well-defined relations both with China and Taiwan, but we have opted to participate in this rhetoric of modern Cold War as defined by Yanushka. So this is the new concept of entrenchment. This is unacceptable for me, and I also express many opinions of many of our comrades. As a party, we have not come up with some firm position on China, so we have had some fragmented discussions, though, but the very concept that if someone else opens Taiwanese representations with diplomatic status, then Lithuania is successful. I don't think that it is to be seen only via the prism of Lithuania. This should be seen via the prism of international relations in the EU. So I don't think this would be a huge accomplishment if we manage to isolate China from international community, primarily by efforts of Lithuania. This is why this is a highly complex issue, and it's very difficult to answer. Should we close it down or push back, or to achieve some agreement to have good relations with both China and Taiwan? Hello, everyone. On your question, and what I want to mention has two aspects. So what is happening in Europe and on China, and what is happening in China, because it's important while we seek to understand the general trends and where we are. First of all, starting with China itself, we speak a lot that Lithuania takes the lead on Taiwanese representation and vaccine, which honestly was even more important for the Taiwanese than this representation. Our vaccines were an even more important aspect for the domestic self-identity of what Lithuania is. First of all, on China, we have to realize that China is changing very rapidly. And China is quite an interesting state. It has learned a lot from Moscow. And what happened in 1972 when Nixon traveled to Beijing and China saw its opportunities to go through the period of new economic policy, NEP, the way Soviet Union underwent. Probably you have read the 12 Chairs with Ostap Bender having an adventure in the Soviet Union under NEP policy. So we should understand that China went through a similar period, and since 1972 it saw a window. US invited it to participate in international trade, and they invited China to be an ally against Soviet Union, and then they would be let in international supply chains, and China joined this chain. It became what it became, and it grew thanks to this decision and its opening. This was its window that it used well, and this window is closing. China knows it, that this window in relations with other countries is closing. What it has achieved, other countries can't but reflect. And what we've been seeing in recent 5 years, China 5 years ago and 20 years ago were two different Chinas. The hope was 5 or 7 years ago that China would more or less democratize and find out democratic institutions, and it would not transform into the West, but it would become one of the players sticking to the same rules in the West-led world. And China understands that this window is closing, and we have to understand one simple thing. China is a communist party, and Chinese Communist Party understands that we start speaking about this existential survival, and the social contract in China between the society and the Communist Party as such has reached its limits. They will not be able to keep growing 6% every year. The social contract in the society existed in China because they had calculated that they need 6% growth every year, because 70 million people would join the labor market in China, and the society is happy. They see a growth, which legitimizes the government. Because of Western hostilities to their growth and the economic reasons in the world economy, this growth is no longer possible, which means that the social contract starts to erode in China. And we see this growing authoritarianism in China. The last plenum of Communist Party, which took place, I think, 3 weeks ago, clearly said that there were 3 persons in Chinese history: Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Xi Jinping. 3 personalities raising China up. We have to understand the trend of where we go. Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Xi Jinping. These are personalities equalized to the ideological leaders of the country, which has the history of 4,000 years. They say that Lenin, Mao Zedong, and the current leader are the people creating China. And in managerial way, it's very clear. You just want to create a very strong authoritarian country to solve a very simple managerial problem. The country will solve major challenges in international relations and international economy. And for this, you need clear hierarchy. And they are creating it. So first, China undergoes a major change. We just have to take note of it. Second, in Europe, starting with Obama, it was Obama starting this direction, responding to challenge from China. Trump hyperbolized it, and he strongly articulated it, and it was the core of this foreign policy strategy. The US still has this triangle in their mind, triangle paradigm: the US, Russian Empire in any form, either Russian Empire or Soviet Union or Federation, and China. And what Trump did, this pseudo-flirtation, which was verbal with Moscow, in fact was a certain small hope that maybe we will join efforts and push them away from China. And honestly, we see the same from Biden. Biden's talks, in fact, is in paradigm of relations with China in their links to Moscow. But as we speak about Europe, this links to China in Europe change every day. It just happened so in Lithuania. The 3 political parties constituting the majority now, they all had Taiwan in our political platforms. They just implemented. This was not some post-factum idea. All these parties had Taiwan on their platforms, not China. We have to emphasize it, and I will explain it later. On electoral cycle, it happened because of electoral cycle. It happened earlier in Lithuania. We could say that, yes, it was because we take the lead and it was our idea, and we just saw what the world would live over 5 or 7 years, because this will be the truth. The world will live in hostility with China, and it will determine the global relation. This was just the beginning of a cycle, and we see it in other countries as well. Over the last 2 weeks, 3 national parliaments in Europe, the French, the Irish, and Dutch ones, passed resolutions on Taiwan. Actually, they went much further politically than us, because these were resolutions. We don't dare to pass a resolution on Taiwan. They go much further. There was a situation last week with a parliamentary delegation coming from all political groups. So when we were leaving, the Slovak delegation was coming on a state jet. 64 members of parliament and business members. This was a huge delegation. So the general trend towards China, Taiwan is just a reflection of this. So everyone is taking certain positions in this new world, and this is a reality. If we see the platform of Social Democrats and Greens in Germany, there in Germany we have to understand that they need to sell cars, and their foreign policy paradigm is about export, but in German platforms and activities, primarily coming from the foreign minister, which will be kind of Joschka Fischer of our times, we see the same. We also see the same from Germany. It's about Taiwan. So the entire Europe is rapidly changing its attitude to China. And as we live, well, in Lithuania, we live in the kind of golden province. Why we were so strongly affected by migration crisis? Because for the first time this foreign policy would come to us directly. We would only read about it in newspapers or Vladimira's articles. So for us it was just a theory, what was happening somewhere far away. So even as members of NATO and EU, we knew little about agenda of Europe. For us, it was just a theory, and all of a sudden, migrants came to our door, and foreign policy just knocked on our door. And this was a shock for us. This was something we would only see on TV. Okay, I think I will have to stop at this. Mr. Paluckas, would you like to react to this maybe potential coalition partners? Well, of course, we have some reflections. Not as a political scientist, but as a politician, I see that colleague goes too deep in certain situations. For example, when they attend Taiwan, they say that Lithuanian society supports the policy on China, while opinion polls show that it's not that true. And I'm sincerely frustrated by this understanding or an attempt to present this new concept of Cold War as something positive, as a positive shift or a positive project that has to be deepened, escalation, isolation, etc. The fact that new or reviving empires share some features is true, and they are the same, either Russia, China, US, or Ottoman Empire as Turkey. So we see the expansion, including economic and political expansion. But in this place, we have two choices. And as I said, either to entrench ourselves in trying to stick to our trenches via this rhetoric, trying to push back and reject, while the second concept is to join this multi-level structure which is relevant to the entire world and to try to soften and mitigate the aggressiveness of this expansion. So these are two different paradigms, two different concepts. And this hyper-enthusiasm that we see from our colleague, I'm not sharing it. I don't support it. There are also other ways to address problems, and what is being said brings us to having no relations and no links. It has never created anything good. Should we refer to old times like iron walls and arms race, it only leads to bad. Maybe Mr. Maldeikis wants to react, but just one more question that I have. Yesterday in the evening, at our Lukas Savickas stressed several times that foreign policy should be effective, and in his opinion, our current foreign policy is not effective enough. And he would ask me, Locius, you said that we need cost-benefit analysis in foreign policy. Why don't you criticize the government because the foreign policy is not efficient? So now I'm forwarding this question from Lukas Savickas. What is the benefit for us from building relations with Taiwan and spoiling relations with China? So what is the benefit right now and what we expect in the nearest future?
To answer your question, two aspects are here, the security and economic one. If we talk about the security, no, I'd start with the economic aspect. It's simpler to articulate. We need to understand clearly that no country is in conflict with China. It's Chinese narrative. If we violate agreements or treaties with China, if we do something more, if we establish representative offices, diplomatic in Taiwan, yeah. However, we do not go away from the single China principle, as China is close to us. We can talk about relations, numbers, etc. It's been going on for a long time. Lithuania has invested a lot, also a lot of effort in China, but they didn't open up. Both in our relations and in terms of our exports, if we talk about the cost and benefit ratio and narrow down everything to numbers, I should say that our export to the Czech Republic is triple compared to our export to China. We export twice more to Kazakhstan than to China. So the Kazakhstan market is much more important to us than Chinese one. Chinese market has never been open to us. It has never been open to us. We need to understand that. We're not losing it because we've never had it. That's the problem. And that should be our starting point. Regarding the possibilities, Lukas Savickas was present during all our meetings, and he was responsible in our group for the such economic points. We shared responsibilities or roles. And if we're talking about the cost and benefit analysis through the economic prism or aspect, they are major, really major. We have a major window. How would we use it is another point. We will do everything. We will meet with Lithuanian businesses. We will have soon meetings discussing the possibilities and what meetings were there. We have lots of possibilities. We are there both for the possibilities in Europe, opportunities in Europe, and because of the attitude, our attitude. We are just like Iceland back in 1991 and its attitude towards it. This is our role there. And if we are talking about Japan and other allies, it's strange that the Lithuanian step is important, but yes, it is important. We have lots of business opportunities there, and they will depend on us primarily. And I wanted to say that, when being there, you find out a new thing and you self-reflect, see yourself. And basically, the discovery I made there is our education system and what we can suggest and offer to them. And we will offer something to them. Regarding the security aspect, the world we live in is not conservative, I would say, but we always have the fight between democracy and authoritarianism, which will get harsher and harsher, more acute. And we will have internal fights within the democracy or contradictions within the democracy. And we see the pressure from disappointed people who want clear and fast decisions, and they're disappointed if they don't get them. And this is the internal growing pressure. we saw those protests not the same as, and we should see what is Russia doing. It's modus operandi. Russia is protecting itself, its interests, its mentality, and the same is done by China. It's defending itself. And by defending themselves, they attack us. They press us more and more and attack us. And we see the situation getting tenser, and we have to reflect and respond. I don't want our country to be surrounded by authoritarian regimes anymore. We just don't want to wake up, just like in interwar times, that we have a situation and we have to respond, and we cannot afford this for the second time. We have to see the trends, the global trends. We cannot live in the hothouse conditions anymore. Mr. Palutskas? Well, our discussion is a bit eclectic. We started about the economy, and we don't mention numbers. It's a bit strange when it happens, to my opinion, but recently that's the key genre. But if we talk about Chinese and Taiwanese potential in economic terms is absurd. The illusion that Taiwan can compensate the Chinese potential is absurd. First of all, let's take into account the effort of various governments to open various markets, both to the U.S. market, non-tariff barriers we faced due to phytosanitary, etc., requirements, and China is quite protectionist, protects its businesses, and Taiwan is quite protectionist as well. It has just waived our opportunity to supply grain to them. But let's listen and hear what businesses say. The business adaptation to those economic and cultural circumstances requires time and effort. For a long time, Chinese exports were growing. Why didn't we achieve the goals? Because the country is far away, and economically unuseful is to export lots of traditional industrial commodities. And the same was said about Taiwan by our grain producers. It's not economically profitable. The same was said by Poles. When we looked for a bank to come to Lithuanian market, the answer was, we are good friends with Lithuania, but we know how to count money. Therefore, when discussing economic things, we drown in illusion sometimes. Therefore, I'm glad we're not talking about microchip factory opening in Lithuania. That was the best illustration of the total misunderstanding of this industry and this market. I'm not going deeper into the arguments because it's the matter of a separate discussion. But when talking about security, I never thought that we could just say that white is black and black is white. I never thought to hear that conflicts increase security. I can be more open. Yes, NATO is focusing. The U.S. is focusing on the eastern region, just like Russia does, and instead of thinking of how to develop our defense architecture in Europe, we are conservatively focusing on what is politically and culturally moving out of the region. So I do not see a higher security in this case. And let me repeat, Taiwan cannot replace the Chinese market. And if we talk about it in economic terms, we needed to talk to businesses, but it wasn't done, and the political and economic argument was not taken into account and evaluated in terms of China. So I'll be the devil's advocate in this situation. So we're talking about Chinese and Taiwanese markets, and why don't we compare Chinese, let's say, a small market for Lithuania, and maybe Japanese, Korean, U.S. markets? Taiwan is not the only alternative. The answer: yes, it's not only Taiwan, but opening the U.S. market was the effort of many governments, and it was open for us, for traditional industries. But when we talk about economy and business, economic profitability should be everywhere, not only tariff and similar barriers preclude us from importing, exporting, and sometimes it's determined by simple economy. And just think about what we Lithuanians could export to Japan in terms of the distance, geographical distance. Lasers account for 80% of scientific applications, but we haven't developed our industrial laser sector. So yes, Chinese market is small percentage-wise, but we have reached by 12 to 15% more. We had reached in terms of Chinese market analysis compared to Taiwan. In terms of cost and business analysis, we'll see it, but let's talk to business associations more, and they will explain why they exported something or didn't export something to certain markets. Let's not be naive and think that our businesses didn't look at the southeastern markets. It's not true, simply. Matas, just please respond in brief, and then the floor will go to the audience. In brief. Before our visit and our parliamentary visits, which is freer form, we discussed it with businesses and discussed what we want from that visit. We talk with businesses. It's not just that we think we'll open it and that's it. What we do is based on what we have and what we can offer. And when we went there, and Lukas Savickas can confirm it, we had our meetings, we checked what we would need to do, and we do it. And the person who will work there, he will represent business interests there, and will make local decisions, and will open will help to work our businesses to work there. He will be our business advocate. It wasn't just we will open it and then we'll see what we'll do. We have pressure from the government, the business, which is asking why you don't have a person there, why he or she is not working there. That's the news instead of why you open or not open it.
Please introduce yourself. Darius Samashka, Ambassador at Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is a question to Mr. Paluckas. You have mentioned the growing aggressive empires, Russia, China, Ottoman Empire, and also you mentioned the US in this land. Is it slip of the tongue, so to say, or is it that you put them all together? And the second question, yes, this is a question, with the remark that now you have advocated for orientation of our European partners in planning our defense, and today more than 80% of NATO capacity is provided by the US. Out of the remaining 20%, major share belongs to France, and they all are Africa-oriented. Do you believe that over the upcoming 10 years, any European partner could provide us with proper security guarantees? Thank you. So on question one, I think this is the right point. This was a figurative statement over the previous periods when the US had major interests in Central or Southern America, and this political influence was used for multiple goals, but we are speaking about the real world, where some countries are our friends and others are not so much friends to us, so we forgive to some more than to others. So as we're speaking about reviving empires with their claims, these are the three major actors. The US, which is engaging in self-isolation, starting with Trump, and tries to reduce its global policeman role. So on one hand, it's understandable, but on the other hand, it changes the global picture and the security architecture. Now, as we speak about beliefs, it's not about beliefs, it's about efforts. And as much we invest in it, the result depends on this. So probably the world, like US, Turkey, and France, constitute the core in terms of expenses and military capacity. But over the term of 10 to 20 years, if we don't start speaking about strategic autonomy of Europe in defense, we will just lose time. And without building this alternative, we can end up in the situation that we have now. Europe invests too little attention and funds on this. So this should be our point of departure, rather than sticking to something that will have to undergo so many time tests in the future. So we should be heading this way. Matas, was you happy to hear the European autonomy? I don't believe in autonomy. I believe in the project of Europe politically. However, in military terms and in terms of agreeing, Europeans have too many conflicting interests. I believe in interests of states, and I believe that states follow them. And if you understand state interests, you can predict how it acts and how it thinks. And you can project their decisions and attempts to influence each other. Europeans are too different from each other in interests to be able to create something similar to their own autonomous military or some other forces. Departure of the US was here to remove this security dimension from us, because we are hard partners to each other politically, because our border is the border of another neighbors, and we keep contacting each other, and these links create certain conflicts. Friendship and conflicts. We Europeans, Europe was born as a field of conflict, and I think that no one was able to unite us except the US in this period. And if the US quits this scheme and politics comes back to the continent, including security politics, and we start playing soldiers in Europe, we will have lots of trouble, primarily vis-à-vis each other. The departure of the US as a moderator and a certain DJ, sorry for this slang, puts us all to one common denominator and puts at the same level. We're just too different. Spain, France, Germany, and Lithuania have two conflicting interests, too many clashes between our interests, and that's the trouble. This is why it will be too difficult for us to have one commander-in-chief of our armed forces. Okay, stick to Lithuanian. So what I mentioned in the beginning is that in general, this is not about position of only Lithuania vis-à-vis China. Let's take the example of Taiwan. 40% of what China exports to the world is created by Taiwanese investors in China. Just to imagine the shares, I can just explain. Taiwan is the major investor in China, and 40%, up to 40% of Chinese export relies on Taiwanese firms there, and these Taiwanese firms are being closed down. They start to understand the domestic trends, and they're also leaving like everyone else. So I just want to explain that this is what all countries are facing currently. This is all just explained to raising costs of logistics or power cuts in some places in China, and this is where factories are stopping. However, this is a general trend. It's not about Lithuania. This is about the general trend. Over the last 10 years, China applied sanctions 152 times. 152 countries, 152 times sanctions were applied by China. Because you give a Nobel Award to someone, sanctions are applied to a country. So is this country free to make some sovereign decisions? As a country, is it responsible for a Nobel Award committee giving a Nobel Literature Award? I think this was a Literature Nobel Award. And then this country suffers because of sanctions. This was what happened to Australia, if we take the example of Australia. Australia heavily depends on China, and what was done to Australia just for a simple thing, because it will say that we will have to look into the origins of virus. So what do we mean by sovereignty in relations with China? If a statement from politicians who says that we will have to scrutinize the origins of virus in China, 50% of your export of a country like Australia is being cut. Is it about Lithuania, or is it in general about the world? Thank you. Gintatas, would you like to react? Just some facts, because what colleague is referring to softly is not truth. These figures we will check up, and we will probably discuss later about Taiwanese investments and why they are leaving China. Is it a part of national policy to repatriate investments? Definitely because of the tensions. And also, honestly, I can't imagine how we will react and what we will do if the government changes in Taiwan due to democratic elections, because the opposition party has a completely different idea of relations with China, and they have been in power many times. And we also forget the difference between export and re-export, what Taiwan produces and what it exports and re-exports, because they have the factories of microchips, which they export to international markets. So this is not that elementary when we speak about economy. We should also understand it a little bit. But honestly, what I don't understand is this enthusiastic speaking. How can it produce some more sustainable relations? Or how it can be beneficial to everyone? Because what I see is only this impetus to build bigger divisions. Yes, of course, we have this spillover effect. If we put a stone in water, later we have more effects. Of course, we could not predict the ideas of international businesses that want to leave Lithuania because of China's pressure. And we have to see it as a real fact. Either we like it or dislike it. However, having too many emotions in policy is a luxury, especially for open economies like ours, and we should be calculating and estimating in agreement with market participants. Well, now ships are leaving and they say we don't exist anymore at customs. We have not even discussed it. So no one warned our business. Is it honest to the social partners and to the group of society, which is also a part of our country? This is our national interest in the end. So, of course, I love this enthusiasm, but I see no rational thinking. It's only about dividing and instigating conflicts, and I don't approve it. So now I'd like to ask the Eastern Europe Studies Center Representative Tomas Janeliūnas, the head of research program, to sum up our discussion. Yes, it's really amazing to see this panel. This is much more emotional than the first panel, and both panelists dare to express clashing positions, and this probably reflects the way the current Lithuanian policy vis-à-vis China and Taiwan is being built. This is a reflection of the fact that we still don't have consensus on this policy, and on one hand, this is natural, because the issue of China is quite fresh for Lithuanian foreign policy. It's new. This is why it takes time to build consensus. On the other hand, this is a major turn for our state's foreign policy, the turn from the so-called one-issue policy, when we only would have Russia as the key component of our foreign policy, which would overshadow all other components, while now we also have one more important issue, that of China, which is and will stay for years or decades to compete with the issue of Russia in our policy. I am sure that it gives us many benefits, not only because we are becoming more interesting to our allies, and we should not explain too much about how much attention we get from the US and how important it is to fit the pattern important for our key security allies. And this is a consequence of us becoming the first, most frequently mentioned by international press and on social media, and we are becoming a kind of pioneers of this issue in the European Union. All these benefits and this attention that we already are getting is a major accomplishment of our foreign policy. On the other hand, however, what surprises me and bothers me that for this major step and for articulation of this second issue, or I would even say the second pillar of our foreign policy, we're still not prepared for it, or not prepared enough, primarily because our main foreign policy institutions have failed to agree on very particular components. So far, it has not been answered how Taiwanese representation emerged rather than Taipei representation. Why on 20th of July institutions get surprised when they receive a Twitter message which comes as a surprise to some major foreign policy actors in Lithuania. So this lack of coordination and preparation, and this is what I agree on with Mr. Paluckas, spills over to other sectors, including economic sector, which also shows lack of preparation for possible sanctions and losses. This could be seen as not so significant given the amount of trade with China, at least in export. So far, probably we have not experienced problems in import, which is about 1 billion euros. However, I see no efforts to prepare for this either. So the level of preparation for me is somewhat frustrating, and I would strongly wish to Lithuania to find its real and well-defined narrative vis-à-vis China, because the same papers that we are preparing now sometimes contain quite controversial statements, because on one hand, we kind of say that we stick to the policy of one China and we don't contradict to it, and on the other hand, in our rhetorics, we clearly stress that China is our strategic foe. which can make some tactical steps more difficult for us in the future. If one day we want to soften our position and we'll try to balance China and Taiwan relations, not to geopolitize neither of them. Naming China as a strategic foe or strategic opponent is an unprepared component, leave alone the fact that it's not agreed with European strategies, since European papers refer to it as strategic competitor, not strategic adversary. So this lack of preparation and emotional expressions in an attempt to improvise with some actions can bring us in trouble, at least in tactics, as we're seeking for the best solution and seeking to confront the Chinese influence. And I think this is the key task. This is what we were successful in the first half of this year, when we both announced quitting the China-initiated 17+1 format and also passed a law which does not allow to develop Chinese companies to develop 5G grids, and also other decisions reducing Chinese threats to us. And these were very consistent and right steps, in my opinions. However, sometimes there are certain poorly coordinated impromptu actions. Maybe because this second pillar of our policy is still very fresh and new. And I would wish to have consistent position from Lithuania on China and Taiwan, and to arrive at consensus between major decision makers on foreign policy of Lithuania. Thank you to Mr. Janeliūnas, and on this note, I announce the end of our conference. I would like to thank our panelists, the chairperson of interparliamentary ties with the Republic of China and the chairperson of Social Democrat group in the parliament. And I would like to thank all participants in Konrad Adenauer Foundation, thanks to which this conference was possible. And I will invite all participants to the lunch.